Letizia Treves, I'm curator of later Italian paintings here at the National Gallery, and I'm here with the Breach Theatre Company who've put on a play on Artemisia called It's True, It's True, It's True.
I'm Billy Barrett, I'm the director of It's True, It's True, It's True and the co-writer.
I'm Ellice, I play Artemisia in the production and I'm a co-deviser, co-writer.
Do you want to say a little bit about your role in the play and perhaps how the play actually came about?
Yeah, so I'm the director and co-writer of the piece, which is based primarily on the trial transcripts of the rape trial, but also explores the ways in which her art relates to her life and related to that trial.
So you went back to the transcripts and reread them and...
Yeah, so the starting point for the show was revisiting these court transcripts, which are translated in a very kind of literal academic tone. And so we sort of reworked them in quite a contemporary way, kind of mixing together some archaic and contemporary language, and also sort of exploding some of Artemisia's paintings into the trial itself. So we have the historical figures of Artemisia, Agostino Tassi, who was the accused, and a neighbour called Tuzia, but we also meet some of the biblical figures that Artemisia was painting and with whom she identified. So
why did you pick on Artemisia? How did you first sort of meet Artemisia?
So it was actually via the exhibition here, Beyond Caravaggio, or through reading about it, particularly in an article that was focusing on Artemisia and why she's been so overlooked in art history, or mainstream art history. And through that article, we heard about the existence of these court transcripts. And we're a company that has before restaged testimonies, but also battles. We're quite interested in reperforming history and how we engage with history as performers. So we took those transcripts as kind of a theatrical invitation to restage them. So what would it mean to restage a trial that happened 4 centuries ago, where even the words that are written down are kind of already unreliable because they've been translated and patched together. And so we were excited by the invitation that they presented as kind of, in some ways, an already written script, although it takes a lot of work to make that dramatically compelling, because although some of the testimonies are very visceral and kind of vivid, some of them, particularly the wording, gets a little bit kind of confusing.
And some are very dry.
And some are very dry.
And some are incorrect. And
yeah, I mean, you get these whole kind of passages about we went in a carriage to Santa Giovanni and you just try and follow it and it's very confusing. But yeah, so we read about the transcripts, we read about the way in which, although it was Agostino who was on trial, it was kind of in a way Artemisia and her sexual reputation that was on trial. She's the one who was tortured, she's the one who was the subject of kind of scandal of all these different voices in Rome saying, I saw her stood shamelessly at her window.
And reputation is actually the key here, because actually Orazio had a lot to lose reputationally, because he's the established painter, you know.
Yeah.
And she, by the time this happens, has been painting sort of independently, but within his house for maybe 2-3 years. We know from the transcripts that she's already teaching a young boy to paint, who's grinding colours for her. So, but he also, Orazio, had a lot to lose. Playing Artemisia, it's quite a tall order. So how did you sort of prepare for the role? Did you, for example, go and look at her pictures? Did you obviously read about her?
Well, before I knew that I was going to play her, and it was when it was just Billy, myself and our other company member Dorothy, we all took a research trip to Florence and we went to the Uffizi and we saw Judith and Holofernes. And I wasn't expecting myself to get so emotional. And actually I think that reaction that we all had to the paintings, that really carried through the process and kind of freaked me out in playing her actually, because I felt so moved. I suddenly felt like I wasn't going to do her justice.
It's such a powerful picture though.
Yeah.
And it's not the only one that's powerful. I mean, there's such a strength in her paintings.
But when you see it, because we'd only seen it on Google Images, so we'd obviously seen it tiny on our screens, to suddenly see it so huge and see all these things that we hadn't noticed before, like the blood splatters on the breasts and the hands and just the way the sleeves were rolled up, things that we just hadn't noticed when they were on a screen.
And they're life-size, so it feels just so real and right up in the picture plane. I mean, a bit like this picture, she crops it, and because they're life-size, you feel like you're in the picture, you're witnessing the event, you feel like you're in the tent with them. And of course, Florence is a really key moment in her life. She moves to Florence after the rape trial. And it's sort of where she really finds kind of both personal but also professional independence. She moves away from her father's workshop and sets up on her own. And it's also the period from which our self-portrait is painted. And it's interesting because in this period, she actually portrays herself quite a lot. And I think that's very much tied up in sort of her sort of promotion of herself. It's a kind of self-propaganda thing as well. And here she is as Saint Catherine, but the wheel, you know, the crown, the martyr's palm, they all feel slightly incidental, almost afterthoughts. And it's almost like she's dressing up. You know, there's a kind of play acting as well in these dressing up, rather like Rembrandt does, or even Cindy Sherman now. You know, I think there's a real theatre in these self-portraits.
Yeah.
The transcripts are very real, I think. You get a real sense of her kind of determination, of her.
Definitely.
She's very prepared by the time she sits down in that witness box.
I think that was the thing that really, in terms of character and portraying her, and when I think the break came for us, we'd compiled all these transcripts after reading through them and laboriously structuring them and making them make narrative sense for an hour-long production. When we got to looking at her as a character, we became quite preoccupied with her age. And the idea of her being a woman on trial at the time, as we were like, oh, she must be nervous. She would be so aware she was in a room full of men. She's probably really, I don't know, shy and overwhelmed. And we just couldn't do that. We couldn't put that on top of it because actually her words are so bold and she's so strong in her opinions, and she obviously just wants to tell the truth. And I think there's a fatigue to her as well of maybe not wanting to be there but having to say that and just wanting to get the truth out there. That actually all the things we tried to put on her, we had to just push away because her voice is so strong.
It is.
That it had to just be that.
And of course, the trial happens actually quite a few months after the rape itself because she continues sexual relations. She's hoping that Tassi will ask her to marry him. He doesn't. And it's actually Orazio, it's her father, who brings him to trial. And I think rereading those documents and sort of more recent interpretations of them, I think it's very clear that she's still very passionate in her voice, but they're very well prepared responses. I mean, she realizes both her, but really her father's reputation is very much at risk here. So you actually feel the pressure of her having to go through this for her father. One of the most kind of moving moments is, of course, when the judge says to her, well, you get the impression they believe she's right, but they can't prove she's right. It's her word against Tassi. And he says, you know, is it all right for us to torture you, you know, to prove that you're telling the truth? And she says, yes. So, of course, they use the sibille, which is this a kind of rope that was tightened around the fingers, which, of course, for an artist, your hands are your work, they're your profession. So it's particularly moving for someone like her. And while it's happening, she says the words, it's true, it's true, it's true, which is, of course, the title of your play. And then she throws out this remark saying, these are the rings, the wedding ring you've given me, to Tassi. So she's got real fire, you know. I mean, she hasn't prepared an answer like that, but you can see there's so much anger there. Artemisia is an artist who just really sort of engages people today, not people necessarily who are that interested in art. You know, just in her life story. I mean, when you started working on this play and started developing the project, did you really get a sense that, I mean, did you know, as you stood on stage for the first time in Edinburgh, you know, that people would love this, that there was a real kind of hunger to know more?
I mean, we hoped so. I think, as we've said before, I think Artemisia is having a bit of a moment right now. There's been quite a few exhibitions, and I know that quite a few people have dramatised her life, sometimes more sympathetically.
More or less successfully.
Yeah, exactly. So actually, part of what we wanted to do was like act as a counter-argument to some of those representations. So there's a film in which, as she's being tortured, she says, I love you, about Tassi. And so we partly wanted
fiction.
to...
She doesn't,
so we partly wanted to
correct.
Correct some of the ways in which she's been represented. And I guess argue for her as a woman who has a lot to say to us today. Obviously in a climate in which people are coming forward with stories about abuses of power, particularly within the creative industries, which is obviously a big link, but across different institutions everywhere. It feels like Artemisia could serve as a bit of an inspiration to us right now. And I think that's what people were connecting with in Edinburgh, which was really exciting.
In the trial, she wins, I suppose, or Orazio wins, you know, and Tassi's not just, found guilty of the sexual assault, but he's found guilty of perjury, of bringing false witnesses, found guilty of slander, so damaging Orazio's reputation. It's a kind of triple win for Orazio. But of course, 3 days after the trial, Artemisias married off and sent to Florence with her new husband. So you still feel slightly like she's this, not pawn in the whole thing, but she, I do think the whole thing must have been sort of, in a way, orchestrated by Orazio. But she's won through, Tassi now is a far less famous painter than Artemisia,
exactly.
and I think, his fame largely rests on what he did to her, which obviously, isn't a great reputational
also her
legacy.
Art, whether it's because she's painting general female experience or her female experience and she's painting about her own story, it just resonates in such a way that I just don't think his would, because it is such an incredible insight and it is so potent. Like the fact that modern women can look at her paintings now and look at these transcripts and find such a resonance with them is incredible. And that was being painted in 1612. She was always going to be the victor.
I think what we found exciting as well was, so there's one narrative which is the court and this kind of procedural legal drama that plays out in this 400-year-old document. But there's also all the stories that she's telling through her art. And whether or not you want to read those autobiographically, she clearly identifies with a lot of the women that she's painting and the scenes that she's painting. And as much as anything, they're really fun to put on stage. You've got people in a witness box arguing over the truth of what happened, and then suddenly you can cut to a woman holding a head and a sword. So all of that was
dramatic
quite exciting.
Potential.
Yeah,
yes.
Exactly.
Well, a lot of her pictures are theatrical, in that sense. I think you're right, and I think a lot has been read in kind of autobiographical terms in her pictures, almost too much, actually. And I think there's definitely a sort of shift now in looking at her pictures slightly more. Someone very cleverly wrote quite recently, if none of the transcripts survived, none of us would read Judith and Holofernes as a sort of pictorial revenge on her rapist, and I think that is important to bear in mind. But I think with Artemisia, given that she's, Germaine Gray called her a magnificent exception. She's so exceptional in her time. You can't help but look at her pictures and understand that there is a sense of self in them. I mean, obviously here it's a self-portrait, but her life is intrinsically linked, with her art. It's got to be. Yeah. It's part of her, artistic and personal journey.
I think also this idea of dressing up that you mentioned and playing a character was really exciting to us in terms of how to stage it. So our staging is kind of half courtroom, half artist studio. So instead of historically accurate witness box and judge's bench, we've got easels and sort of painter's benches and a paint trolley actually that comes out. Because we wanted it to be a kind of a real historical and legal space, but also an imaginative space where suddenly an actor can go and grab a cloak and throw it on and a beard and be the elder in Susanna and the Elders.
It was also really important to us to have that sense of play that runs throughout it, because it is a very, the subject matter is very serious and so many people have experiences of it and will be bringing things to it. And I think, especially as female audience members watching it, you want to give something different other than just traumatizing. And what she does in her other paintings that we were really struck by, obviously this is a self-portrait, but by bringing women together to carry out actions like Abra and Judith against Holofernes, we wanted to create that sense of play amongst three women, which is why it's an all-female production, even though there's a lot of men that are represented on the stage. It just felt very important to us that there was play amongst females, because that's also really supportive in the subject matter that we're talking about. And in representing her, and we felt like that was something that she wanted to represent, so we could give it.
And I think there's something about the way in which these painters would have models and dress them up and set them up in painting positions that was exciting to us in terms of dramatising.
Yes, and actually as a female artist, that would have been quite tricky. It would have been very difficult to, well, we know from her letters later on in her life, she's complaining about how costly models are, how expensive they are. Yeah, and then from these transcripts, that Orazio had male models coming in, no female models. But for Artemisia, she's painting a woman. She's got herself. She doesn't need a model. She needs a mirror. So it's interesting looking at these self-portraits because there are quite a number from these years when she's in Florence. where she's wearing, so there's a picture very closely related to ours where she's playing the lute and she's wearing a turban and she has an earring and she looks like a gypsy, you know. And we know it's a self-portrait because it's mentioned in inventory very early on and described as such, but it's in exactly the same pose. And, you know, you can see it's just sort of dressing up in different guises, the sort of theatre of it. And like I said before, the play acting and sort of using her own image, you know, for two reasons. One, it's practical, you know, it doesn't cost you anything, and you have a, you know, she was renowned to be quite beautiful, so you've got a, you know, a nice, beautiful face to use, and inexpensive, but also it is, you know, your mark in a way, you know. So someone, you know, buying a picture like this, someone for whom this picture would have been painted, would have known they were getting a picture by Artemisia, but also of Artemisia, and it would have had a sort of extra kind of cachet of having her face in it.
Yeah.
So the play's about to open here in London?
Yes, it's on at the New Diorama Theatre from the 16th of October to the 10th of November, with matinees on Saturdays.